Okay, in this video, I'm going to compare two spring-driven stringing machines on the market. On this side is the most common. It's the manual crank string machine. It uses a spring. And over here we have the MS200, Stringway MS200. It also uses a spring. And however, this is not constant tension pull. It's a lockout machine, as you know. This is a spring machine, but it's not a lockout machine. It has constant tension pull. It is not a lockout machine. The constant tension pull is just as good as any drop weight machine, better than just about any electronic machine. And the reason for this is because the spring used in both of these machines are very different. Its function is very different. It's a very different spring. It's a very different system, very different tension mechanism, and I'm going to explain the difference in this video. Now, this machine is very common. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, maybe at some pro shops or whatever. And this is a manual crank spring-driven machine. Well, they say it is a spring-driven machine. It's a but it's the more accurate name is probably a manual crank, because the spring does not create the tension. The spring does not pull the string at all. The manual crank pulls the string. This creates tension. As you see, as I turn this, it moves. Well, this is a string gripper. If you can imagine a string is in here. As I turn this, it's going to pull the string. Right? As I turn this, it pulls the string. So this tension head moving along the track is what pulls the string. It's the tension. The reason why they have this little tiny spring here is it's more of an indicator to show when the reference tension is reached, the spring, it contracts a little bit and it triggers this lever to lock. That's why it's called a lockout machine. And so here we go. I'll show you again here. Now, let's see. We'll set the tension a little bit higher here, and here we go. So as you can see, when I pull the crank, as it's moving, it's pulling the string. Now look at the spring here. If you look at the spring, oh, here we go. Now it's starting to contract a little bit. Oh, and it just triggered the lever. Maybe you can try again. So as you hear, it's starting to contract. And as it contracts and it contracts, because you can see it's having some resistance because it's reaching the tension, and as it contracts, then the lever locks. And that's why it's a lockout machine. So as soon as the lever locks, I cannot turn the crank at all. I cannot pull any longer. It's locked out. It's called a lockout machine for this. And the bad part about this is that it's not constant tension pull. As you're stringing, you're going to lose tension. And a constant tension pull will pick up the slack when there is slack, but this will not pick up the slack. That's why typically in this machine, you need to string or set the tension much higher than stringing on a constant tension pull machine. Okay, and that's why typically when you string on this, you need to set the tension really high. It's more stress on the string, more stress on the racket. And you're going to find that the tension, or I should say the stiffness of your racket, will change very rapidly over time. If you just play tennis or badminton or any other racket sports, you're going to notice that the stiffness of your string bed will drop rapidly. And that's because a lot of the slack hasn't been taken up. Okay, and just for comparison, we're going to measure the spring here. It's a very tiny spring. You can see the spring is about 6 centimeters in length. This is the spring is fully relaxed. As you can see, the tension is set at 0 right now, so there's absolutely no load on the spring whatsoever. It's about 6 centimeters, roughly. 6, a little bit more than 6. And its diameter is about a little bit less than 2 centimeters. A little bit less than 2 centimeters. And as you can see, the spring, it's made of a pretty thin wire, pretty thin metal. It's not really meant to be really rugged, to undergo a lot of stress. That's not what it's designed for. Now, as we move over to the Stringway MS200, this again is another spring-driven machine. However, the spring is a very different spring. It's much longer, much thicker, a much bigger diameter, much more durable, much more robust, and it is the spring that will constantly pull the string. That's why it's a constant tension pull machine. Now, first of all, the length of the spring will extend. See, it's a foot pedal machine. As I step on the foot pedal, it operates the tensioning mechanism. So the spring extends from the tension head all the way down to the foot pedal. So it's a very long spring. You know, it's roughly this long, which is roughly about 75 centimeters. 75 centimeters, maybe 2.5 feet or something. It's a very long spring. It's compared to the spring on the lockout machine. It's, you know, about 12, 13 times as long. It's a very long spring. So it's a very long spring, and that means that when it's under stress, under load, it's the full strength of the spring is using less than 10%. And here we look at the thickness of the spring, or the diameter. Okay, so this is the diameter of the spring. Now, if you can see here, it's roughly a little bit less than 4 centimeters in diameter. I don't know if you can see this. Maybe if I put this like this, maybe you can see it a little bit better. You know, I mean, it's roughly 4 centimeters in diameter. So compared to a lockout machine spring, which is less than 2 centimeters, it's literally twice as wide in diameter. And if you look at just the wire used to make the spring, it's much thicker. It's very thick, very strong wire compared to the lockout machine, which it uses a very thin wire. So this spring is constantly pulling. It's constant tension pull. And a lot of people ask me, well, how long does the spring last? How long does it last before it starts to stretch, before it loses tension, before it breaks? And it doesn't do any of that. It's, you know, it only uses 10% of its strength. It's only under stress 10%. So it has a lot of leeway in terms of that. I mean, you could probably pull a tennis string maybe, I don't know, several hundred pounds and not stress the string out. So you shouldn't worry about that. This machine has been on the market for over 30 years. People buy it to use in shops. They string rackets every day, all day long, for many years. Some are still in some of those first machines are still being used today for 30 years plus, and not a single owner has complained about the spring stretching, warping, or breaking, or needing repair, or exchanging or changing the spring. So I would not worry about that. The springs in your car are under a lot more stress every day than the spring in here, and they don't wear out. So the spring is one of the most reliable things about the machine. And so that's why the Stringway MS200 is a good constant tension pull machine. Because it's constant tension pull, you can set the tension at a relatively low to create a relatively high stiffness. And that's very important when stringing polyester strings, because of course you should not pull harder than 52 pounds, because then it loses its resiliency. Whereas something like this on the lockout machine, you would need to often set the tension higher than 52 pounds, maybe 60, 65. to get the same stiffness as setting the tension at maybe 50 on this machine, on a MS200 machine. And that means that you're playing with overstretched polyester strings without much resiliency, a lot more a shock to your body, more likely to hurt yourself, having wrist, elbow injuries. And the stiffness does drop much faster on this machine as opposed to the MS200. So I hope this has been informative. And if you have any other questions about the difference between these two machines, as far as the tension mechanism is concerned, please write a comment or something, let me know, and I'll try my best to reply.